طيب الزملاء المشاركين
Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, may the blessings of God be upon you all, and welcome to the second day of this workshop organized by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies with the Conrad Adnan Institute on the economic diversification in the Gulf states. We have 5 speakers today. Will be tackling this theme from different angles. Dr. Nawaf Alabduljader, Mr. Ayhab Saad from the Doha Institute, and Mr. Hamid Turki Al Said and Dr. Yousuf Al Balushi from Oman, and Sebastian Sons, the political analyst at the African Center, and we have 15 minutes allocated to each speaker. Then we'll have an open discussion. Our first speaker will be Dr. Nawaf Alabduljader. He's from Kuwait University, and he is an expert in startups and entrepreneurship. He has extensive writings on this subject, and he is one of the 29 authors of the paper entitled Before It's Too Late. Dr. Nawaf will be giving us his vision about the economic diversification in Kuwait. Dr. Nawaf, you have 15 minutes. Thank you very much. I don't want to spend the time on the introduction because my colleague yesterday did that. I think she alluded to the defects in the Kuwait's economy yesterday. We, the 29 academicians in Kuwait, because of our concern for the economic situation in our country and our fear that the welfare state is threatened if our economy continues to be a rentier economy. 90% of the country's income is due to oil, and in the job market, of course, the biggest share goes to the public sector and government employment. And the problem, of course, oil prices fluctuate and they depend on supply and demand. And when the oil prices go down, the government's revenues go down, and half of the population is below 24. So therefore, expenditure on wages and salaries increases and consumes 70% of the government's revenues. And because of the relatively young age of the population, and we said because of this situation and because the government revenues rely on the oil prices, we had a deficit in the last 5 years, and it's likely to continue and increase in the future. And there is also the imbalance in the job market because the vast majority, maybe 4 out of 5 Kuwaitis work for the government. Added to that, of course, the weakness in the education system, and the international institutes which measure these things find that unfortunately Kuwait is amongst the worst in Gulf countries, and therefore the educational standards are really low. This is so much, the gentleman's sound is disconnecting. This is so much that some people called it a drought in the education outcomes because of the lack of positive results. Dr. Hassa, my colleague who spoke yesterday, alluded to these things, and I'll try in this session to continue what she started. And she mentioned the pillars. And as I said, we are 29 academicians from different disciplines and fields of speciality, presented this vision, which generated a lot of interest because 29 academicians, despite their political and other differences, have come up with a unified vision. In a country like Kuwait, usually political differences cause an impasse and in matters like this, but luckily we managed to bypass that and come up with this combined vision. The point I would like to talk about is sustainability of the economy. And by that, I mean the long term and not just solving the problems for the short term. So some proposals and solutions can solve the problem in the short term, but compound them later on in the long term. Like, for example, the crisis of liquidity that the government is facing. Some of the proposals in this regard and suggestions that the government should draw from the Future Generations Fund. This may solve the problem immediately, but in the long run, this will be a problem because first, it will be a violation of the rights of the future generations. And secondly, because of Kuwait's credit rating depends largely on its assets in this fund, in the Future Generations Fund. If we start withdrawing from this fund, then our credit rating is bound to be affected, and consequently our ability to borrow money will be impacted negatively. If we add to that, if you borrow for the public debt or the future generations funds can solve the liquidity problem in the long term, but will not solve the government's long-term problems. If we borrow, say, 10 billion now to solve the liquidity crisis, in a few years, when the number of people entering the job market will increase and we will be facing the same problem and using the same solution and increasing the defect and the imbalance. And one of the main pillars of the economy will be negatively impacted in the long run, and not only in the short run. The second pillar, which I think is very important, and that is transparency and combating corruption. I think all of us, the 29 academicians, agree on this. Any economic reform will not be accepted by the population unless it's coupled with fighting corruption and holding corrupt people accountable and those who steal the public purse. By that, we mean fighting the entire system or regime of corruption, not just individuals. For example, if a Kuwaiti citizen wants to start a project, there is no transparency in the procedures. The legislations are not clear. Like, for example, any promotion in government employee simply depended on the length of service and the qualifications, but and even those who are corrupt or who are not attending and putting in regular hours were not held accountable. That nobody was sacked because of these things. They continued their career path. And for this reason, the government was employing people who they did not need. Many people were working and receiving salaries without any productivity. And when we say we are against corruption, by that we mean all types of corruption, whether an employee who is receiving salary without doing any actual work, or people who are stealing from the public funds, because both things end up destroying the country and its economy. Another very important pillar is social justice, and we spend a lot of time focusing on that because in most of its policies, government relies on the principle of equality and equity rather than social justice. And for example, now in the state of Qatar, we have a system of providing a month's salary given to people who work in the private sector to encourage them. And this kind of subsidy or support is the same for someone who is in his 20s, who's just joined the company or whatever, and it will be equal to someone who spent all their lives working and gaining experience, and they're treated the same. Also for the government's subsidies and supports for the utilities, someone who lives in a small apartment gets the same amount of support like someone who lives in a huge palace, for example. This, of course, is not right. It should not be granted equally because this will create a negative impact. We want it to be on the basis of social justice. And also the companies get the same treatment regardless of their participation in the country's economy and productivity. So therefore, we are not directing the private sector in the right way to support the government and the economy and to make our economy less reliant on the oil sector. And these subsidies should be directed towards the companies in accordance with their productivity and share in the economy. The universities also are an important point to talk about. They get grants inside the country. The universities which are very poor in their standards and outcomes get the same amount of help or subsidies or grants with others which are more successful and contribute more and better. And this, of course, does not do much to improve the quality of the educational system. Dr. Nawaf, we have 2 minutes, please. So therefore, this equality in distributing these subsidies and support becomes even more important when we have a private sector which is relying on consumerism. The final pillar, to summarize, is most of the policies adopted in Kuwait are based on personal whims and desires rather than scientific evidence. They are not evidence-based. We believe that any decision should be based on evidence and scientific research and expertise rather than just be done on personal whims and desires. We lack transparency in this regard, and the information upon which decisions are taken should be made available to the average citizen and the members of parliament, the representatives of people, civil society, so that everyone is informed. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nawaf, for respecting the time allocated. So you talked about the situation of the economy in Kuwait and the need to come up with reforms before it is too late. We would like to move to our second speaker, who is Dr. Ayhab Saad. Dr. Ayhab is an assistant professor of economics at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. So his research concentrates on international commerce, political economy, and he has authored a number of scientific books and articles where he talked about the repercussions of the GCC crisis and the impact on the economy of the state of Qatar. Dr. Ayhab is going to present a paper about export diversification in Qatar, progress, policy implications, and the road ahead. Thank you very much. So it is exactly 2:50. So I would like to thank the moderator for this introduction. So I have a number of slides that I would like to share with you. As it was expressed by Dr. Marwan, I would like to talk about export diversification in Qatar, progress, policies, policy implications, and the road ahead.
Okay. Before I talk about export diversification, let me just throw an idea here. What do we mean by export diversification, and is it different from economic diversification? Because I'm sure right now my colleague, Dr. Ilyas, thinking, Ayhab, are you trying to put here the cart before the horse? You talk about export diversification and we still don't have economic diversification in Qatar or GCC countries. No, this is not what I'm trying to do. But I'll try to convince you that export diversification is an important tool to achieve economic diversification. So history, that's kind of what history taught us. And if we learn something from history, that countries with export-oriented policies succeeded in achieve economic diversification much faster than inward-looking countries or economies. So it seems counterintuitive, but this is what's happening. Like by being outward-looking and promoting export, this will help you achieve broader economic diversification. So they are connected to each other. So here I will be talking about export diversification, not economic diversification broadly, but as I say, they are very connected to each other and it's not putting cart before the horse. Now so let me first through this idea, like why diversification, right? So usually when we talk about classical trade theory, when we talk about trade theories, the emphasis usually on specialization, not diversification. It makes sense to tell Qatar, look, you have a comparative advantage in oil and gas, so you should specialize in this, export this to the world, and import the goods that you have comparative disadvantage in. And this is where the gains from trade come from, right? This is what we teach our students. This is what most trade theorists tell us to do, specialize in goods that you're really good at producing it. And it's not diversification. We rarely hear this word diversification among academics or in the international trade textbooks. And this is true, by the way, and this is exactly where the gains from trade come from. It comes from specialization, not diversification. However, I would like to argue here that for Gulf states, the situation is a little bit different, right? And it's a little bit more complicated. But before that, I'll try to convince you that because of this specialization, the Gulf states, like, they have achieved a lot. They use the oil exports, right, to grow their economies. They are one of the fastest growing countries in the world. Don't underestimate this achievement. And if you look at the human development indicators and index, they are doing amazingly fine, right? If you look at the education, literacy rate, you look at mortality rate, you look at the human development index, and it seems that Gulf states are doing really good. Doing business data, business environment, they're all ranked very high in the world ranking. So, and this is the good part. However, we still need diversification in GCC in Gulf states. So why do we need that? So here the argument comes, like I'm trying to tell you, like Gulf states are different in terms of their specialization, because oil exports, they're not just typical export. They derive the whole economy, right? If you look at this picture quickly and you see there is obvious correlation between oil prices and real consumption per capita. When the oil prices go down, and we know this means export, the volume, the value of export go down, so the economy also suffer and goes down as well, as you can see. And this is historical data from 1980 to 2010. So it's more than export. Oil export only derive the whole economic activities. That's one issue. The other issue is, we know that the growth model in GCC has its own weakness. I will not talk about this weakness because my colleagues yesterday, they have highlighted the weakness in the growth model enough. So here I'm trying to convince you it's more than just exports, and really we need diversification as an insurance against external shocks that a country cannot control, like, you know, once we have a price shock, negative price shock, this will affect the economy a lot. The macroeconomic volatility will be very high in GCC country, as you can see, because of this concentration in exports. So think of this diversification is much needed in GCC country as an insurance against external shocks, sector-specific shocks, to be more accurate. So what do we know about natural resources and export diversification in general? And this is like, I'm just a stylized fact. We know that rich natural resource countries in general, they have high level of export concentration. And this is the case in Gulf states as well. Like, for example, the share of oil exports is around 70% of total export, more than 70% in many, many countries. So we have high concentration, and we call this in academia intensive margin of exports. Exports tend to be very concentrated in one good. More importantly, or equally important, is we know that countries rich in natural resources usually have low number of exported commodities. And this is also very important. It's not just that all our exports or the lion's share of our export is concentrated in oil, but we don't export that many commodities. And this is also very important. And this we call in the literature extensive margin of exports. And broadly, this is known in the literature as Dutch disease or natural resources curse, okay? However, that does not mean if you are rich in resources, you cannot escape this. You still can achieve some economic diversification and export diversification. And this is what we learn from history. It's hard, but still achievable, okay? So if I just want to give you a quick idea about diversification, export diversification in Qatar and in other GCC countries in general. So if you look at Qatar here, 90%, more than 90% of total exports is oil exports. Like the share of oil export out of total export around 90%. This is very, very high level. And this is also, you can see, this is common across the region. Maybe UAE, they having a little bit more diversification, and the share of oil export or hydrocarbon export is less than, it's around 60%. For other countries, it's even much higher, especially Kuwait. So Kuwait and Qatar here, they are one of the highest, they have one of the highest concentration in export, export in the world. So this picture tells you, and these numbers from 2010, this picture alone tells you, look, we still don't have the kind of export diversification we want. And this is just one alarming fact. So has there been any improvement in, this is also another, just to communicate the same information. And here I'm trying to tell you, if you want to put these numbers in perspective, and here I want to look at the share of manufacturers export in total export. So here I give you the share for example, Oman or Qatar, it's less than 10%. Less than 10% of total export in Qatar is coming from manufacturing export. So, and you can see for most of the Gulf states, the numbers are very low. If you want to compare this, for example, to Pakistan, like around more than 70% of Pakistan's exports coming from manufacturing sector. So this gives you kind of perspective if you want to compare the GCC region with different regions in the world. And you can see by far GCC is not faring very well in this, in terms of the share of manufacturers export. So we know right now we're not very diversified. The question is, has there been any progress in terms of export diversification? And here we look at very like a long horizon of historical data. So we have data from 1962. And we want to compare the export diversification in 1962 with 2010. So the index we use here, we call the TIDE index. This is index used generally to measure concentration or inequality, if you wish. So the lower the index is, the more diversified the economy is. So if you look at Qatar here, so you can see the blue bar is the index for diversification in 1962. And the red bar is the diversification in 2010. And you can see the lower the number, the more diversified the economy is. So this is exactly what you want to see. You want to see the bars going down. And this is exactly what we see. So this is good news in a way that most Gulf states they have some success in diversifying their export and their economy. As you see, the red bars always lower than the blue ones. So there are some progress here if you look in the last 40, 50 years. So this is the same, but right now we're looking at the shorter historical data. It's from 1990 to 2010, the same index, style index. So ideally what you want to see this trend going down, because the lower the index, the more diversified the economy is. And obviously you can see this is not happening, especially in the case of Qatar and Kuwait. Particularly, this is either stable or going up. So the economy even getting less diversified and opposed to more diversified. Of course, in the case of United Arab Emirates, you can see the line is a little bit going down. We started here at 5, and then we ended here in 2010. So it's very interesting to extend this series to 2020, and this is what I'm doing in a different research paper. But the results aren't ready yet, so I'm not going to present the results here. Okay. Now, the big question is, and we all care about, how to diversify, right? How to diversify export. I'm just looking, I have 4 minutes. So if you look at the literature and from cross-country findings, we know there are some, common policies or right now agreement on many things, including human capital, better institution quality, better and deeper financial system, trade liberalization, and macroeconomic policies, stable macroeconomic policies. This is what the literature found. If you want to diversify your economy away from oil, so you need to invest in human capital, you need to improve your institution, and so on and so on. So this is from cross-country findings, and it's not unique to GCC area. So in terms of what has been done in Qatar or in GCC region, actually they have done all of that, right? They kind of implemented all the conventional policies that promote diversification. So they're doing pretty well in terms of what they need to do in terms of investing in education, infrastructure, in liberalizing trade, FDI, improving innovation, improving business climate. So they have done a lot, and I give you here some examples. You can go over it. I'm not going to talk about in a specific more details. And we all know about the visions, like for example, Qatar National Vision 2030, and we know what kind of policies. For example, sometimes they also start investing in some specific sectors, like Qatar Airways. And here I would like to borrow what our colleague yesterday said. I think it was Dr. Hissa, like, you know, for us to diversify, you don't need to be all over the places. Just focus on 2-3 more industries, right? And so now we are less reliant on oil in some way or another. And I think this is a good strategy in the short and medium term. So what has not been done, I mean, or what could have been done even better, I would say, look, education, we know that, like, you know, Gulf states been investing a lot in education. However, there's still a lot more to be done. If I give you just one number, the spending on education was about 3.9% in total GDP. The global average is 4.6. Okay, this is the share of total spending, the percentage of total spending on education in GDP. So there is still more room to improve education and spend more in education. Another thing that here I'm also focusing on export diversification. So there more emphasis is needed on export-oriented policy. And I just show you this graph very quickly, okay? And I want to compare it with specifically with Mexico and Malaysia and Indonesia. There are 3 examples where countries in some degree succeeded in diversifying their economy away from oil or natural resources: Mexico, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And you can see this is a measure of export sophistication. It's different from export diversification. The higher the index, the better the sophistication. And you can see these countries have succeeded in improving or their export sophistication index. Okay, so they start producing more sophisticated goods and commodity and services. So for the GCC region, this is unfortunately not the case. Maybe, so you can see export sophistication is still stagnated around its 70s level. Okay, meaning that we're not investing a lot in export, and we're not improving the quality of exports in the GCC region. So I think I have 1 minute, and here I want to, where most of the discussion should be, I believe, what is really missing. So we know diversifying away from oil is very hard, and this is what history tells us, so no question of that. But we also know that GCC countries have almost done everything they could do. They followed most of the conventional policies to support diversification. They have succeeded, but still not to the level they wanted to see, or compared to the level that Mexico, Indonesia, or Malaysia have achieved, even though those 3 countries haven't implemented the kind of policies that GCC region has implemented. So what's really going on? What is really missing? If we are following what economists and policymakers telling us to do, and still we're not achieving this, the diversification we want. And here I just throw this like idea, and it's a food for thought mainly. I mean, IMF start talking about this, and World Bank is all about the right incentives. What do we mean by providing the right incentives? I think I'm a little bit late. So here, what I want to tell you, like, look, countries don't export, firms export. Of course, this is except in GCC region, because we know the export are just oil, and oil is owned by countries. But in general, firms export. So if you want to diversify your exports, you need firms. So if you look at firm entry in GCC countries, is very low. The number of newly created firms is really low. Why is that? Why don't people create firms? And if they choose to create firm, the firms they create, they are usually in non-tradable sectors. Why is that? Because of incentives. They don't have incentive to engage in risky behavior, right? Here, it's more profitable for me to focus on non-trade sectors and have some business with the government, like, more stable, more profit, like this government contract. And most that the firms and projects here deal with non-tradable sector because they rely on a government contract in some way.
One more minute, Dr. Ayhab.
Yes.
One more minute.
Let's talk about migrations policies. They need a serious reform. So you need people to engage in risky behavior, to be entrepreneurs, right? Because this is how we diversify the economy instead of our export. So for us, like, and this is maybe a very radical idea, if you wish, let's talk about migration policies. If I have an idea right now here as a migrant, most likely, like, I invented something, I will take this and go back to my country or wherever in the US and register it there. Why? Because here, like, it's like I'm not a citizen here. So the policies are very strict in terms of what I can do as a migrant, right? So I don't have, like, it's not that flexible environment for migrants to start their own business and look at and invest in activities in the long term or in risky activities. So we need a lot of policy reforms in terms of migration here. Finally, I talk about custom union in GCC. This is important. We need a custom union in the GCC region. And this will help integration, will help export diversification a lot. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور أيهاب. كان بودي إنه أتركك تستمر لأنه
No, I'm very late. Sorry.
كان يعني ممتع وفي كلام كثير.
Thank you very much for your intervention. And we're going to leave some of the points to the Q&A session. So we're going to have some time that is going to be allocated to the Q&A session. I would like to thank you, Dr. Ayhab. You talked about export diversification in the state of Qatar. I would like to move to Dr. Adham bin Turki Al Said. Dr. Adham is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics and Finance at the College of Economics and Political Science at Sultan Qaboos University. And he is a member of the Oversight Authority at Mizzen Bank. So he contributed in a number of topics such as macroeconomy 2020 vision of Oman 2040 vision. Dr. Adham, welcome. Dr. Adham is going to talk about SMEs as a vehicle of job creation and economic diversification, the Omani experience. Dr. Adham, you have 15 minutes. Please, if you can let me know when it is time for me to stop my intervention. Are the slides clear? So please allow me to speak in English. After that, I can respond in Arabic as well.
Very briefly about Oman's experience in fostering SME development as a tool for employment and job creation and economic diversification. I'll lean more on the employment part because that's really where I have more data. I'd like to also thank my colleagues from the Authority for Small and Medium Enterprise Development and Oman Startup Hub for the data that they've provided. Basically, my talk is going to focus on 4 key points I'd like to highlight. First of all, very quick analysis of the labor market, very high level, kind of a precursor to why the SME job creation policy came through. And then I'll talk a little bit about the SME development itself, and then look at the SME status. And then finally, focus a little bit on startups. And I think I'll be picking up some of the stuff from Dr. Ayhab's points as well. Ayhab, sorry. So just to kind of give you a perspective of some of the demographic structures in Oman, similarly in the GCC countries. I hope you can see the pyramids right in front of me for the Omani population and the total population. And what's visible is that the migrant population that is in Oman skews the population more towards the male gender, and specifically on the working age male gender, between the ages of about 25 to 40 to 45. This kind of creates a bit of a conundrum in the Omani market, because as with its GCC sisters, Oman has a large working migratory population. And this particular population has been very active in the labor market, and that has picked up significantly in the last 15 or so years, where we found that from 2007 onwards, it's peaked to about more than 2.2 million workers for Omanis and non-Omanis in the market. But clearly you can see the dominance of about 80% plus in the market comes from migrant workers with different skills, mostly low-skilled and less educated compared to their Omani counterparts.
We are not following this in the slides. Slides are not showing.
All right, usually this is an issue here. So I hope these are more visible.
Yes.
Excellent. Right, so just quickly recapping, the demographics are leaning more towards male gender because of the policy of attracting the large supply of mainly South Asian workers from different countries. And this obviously is visible in the quantity of labor in the labor market. 80% plus are from migratory labor and 20 to 25% in Oman. And this is predominantly everyone in Oman, public and private sector. Women's participation generally is quoted low for Oman because of this very reason, because of the skewed sort of gender distribution. But in the public sector, women occupy about 40% plus of employment, where there's a better balance compared to less than 13% or so in the private sector, at least for 2019. Now, the unemployment issue obviously is very prominent in all of our discussions as we talk about diversification, and one of the outcomes is to create jobs and sustainability. Now, when we look at the overall unemployment rate in Oman for the whole labor market, the numbers aren't really as shocking because they fall between 2 to 3%. But a deeper dive into those numbers kind of tell us a different story. For one, if we look at the Omani population and the unemployment rate jumps by about another maybe 5 to 10% at my estimates. There are no official estimates for Omani population specifically. That's one obvious fact. But the other fact is that female unemployment rates are significantly higher than their male counterparts. And this is where labor market biases come through. We've heard this yesterday from some of our colleagues from Kuwait, finding how private sector attractiveness for females is quite different from males. And the reasons, I believe, are quite similar here in Oman as well, in terms of productivity and availability for work and working hours. So the labor market in Oman effectively is faced with a very difficult balance between a low-wage, low-skilled, but reasonably experienced foreign expatriate labor that's able to fill the jobs, quote unquote, at a cheaper rate, with more flexibility for that population in comparison to the need to create jobs by creating nationalization and training programs and heavy investments in education. And to kind of address these issues, Oman has used a number of policies. Don't worry too much about the finer text here, but really the policies kind of fall within 6 or 7 areas, primarily localization of jobs through quotas, minimum wage, training and skilling, sponsorship system that supports restrictions on foreign labor and the numbers, job security funds and pension reforms to bring the two sectors, public and private, together. But what's been the drive in the last few years was SME development and developing SMEs to kind of create self-employment as a solution to some of the job challenges. And in Oman, like many countries, we've defined SMEs in a typical manner based on headcount and the turnover of companies. And this became the official definition just a few years ago. Traditionally, Oman has used a more capital-based approach to define what type of company you are and in what economic activity. Now, despite this definition, what we find is in the pie chart in front of you, you will see the definition by capital as registered in a commercial register. And these numbers are in Omani riyals. So they're about, the smallest size of companies is under 10,000 capital. And it goes all the way to about 5 or 6 million riyals worth of capital, which you put at startup. Now, most of the companies in Oman, to about 99% of them, fall under 500,000 Omani riyal. Now, these companies are not defined as SMEs officially, but if you register with the SME authority, which was recently created about 5-6 years ago, you'll be considered an SME that receives special support from the government through subsidized loans, special business development program, incubation, and support in procurement, which became a way to support these businesses and create a lifeline and to create an attractive means of developing or starting up your businesses. And up to now, there's about 50,000 companies registered under the authority from the 300,000 companies in Oman, which are predominantly anyhow small or medium enterprises, but not defined at least in the commercial register. So what does that mean for these companies? Well, for one, we've seen significant development in the ecosystem in Oman. In 2013, just before this large shift towards SME development, we've mapped out a system on the left-hand side, which was very simple, primarily funding and capacity building. In 2018, we repeated the same exercise, and what we've seen is some dramatic change because of this government sort of tipping towards SME development and self-employment. New funds, corporate assistance, government organizations chipping in with different programs, incubation, startups, the whole lot is there. However, one would ask, have we been successful in changing the system to something more effective? Well, I would take from Dr. Ayhab's point earlier on that businesses in the GCC have been focused on the non-tradable. So are our SMEs, unfortunately, at this point. Most of our SMEs have been focused on either construction, wholesale and retail, food and beverage, lodging. Most of these services are confined to a geographical region. And these descriptions are very generic, by the way. So even manufacturing could be simply like a very simple, non-technical way of producing very basic goods. Whether they're exportable or not is a bit of a challenge, which I'll look at in the next couple of slides. So our SMEs are still very home-based. They're not out there, they're not competing, they're not international. And this is a big challenge, I believe. Their contribution to GDP is rather modest at the moment, estimated somewhere around 17% in 2018. Hopefully we'll get better measures in the next couple of years as well. But most of the sectors where the economy operates, and we think there is some value added here, retail, construction, manufacturing, more importantly, SMEs tend to play a small part in most cases. The one that concerns me most, which I want to connect to the last point in a moment, is the ICT sector, where innovation is possible. And that contribution is extremely small, less than 1% of SMEs actually add value, or I should say add GDP value over there. Speaking of exports and export diversification, Oman is still highly dependent on oil. But if we look at SME exports, we find that from those manufacturing, the 30% or 25%, they dominate the portfolio of exports of SMEs, which is something positive, I think, and something that we need to build on. However, SMEs manufacturing exports themselves form only 30% of the total manufacturing exports of Oman, which means there is a significantly long way of bringing these companies to contribute more to our export diversification portfolio. Do they create employment? Well, interestingly, the companies registered, the 50,000 companies registered with the authority for SME development, create almost 30 to 40% of the jobs available in the market, which is something I think is reasonably positive. However, there's a bit of a drawback that 80 to 90% of these jobs are created where expatriate workers are found to be more attractive to fill them. So this is a bit of a challenge when we're looking at job creation and employment opportunities. And it turns out to be, if we look at a very rough estimate from the individuals who started up their businesses or are considered self-employed, each one of those, according to the statistics I've received, can create approximately 23 jobs. So it's a 1 to 23 ratio is quite interesting because that's something we can build on. But can we make those jobs more attractive for the local nationals? That is the challenge. And finally, I would like to bring this to a kind of a connection to that ICT comment I made earlier, where we look at whether ICT companies and tech companies, startups that have been receiving significant venture capital investments and angel investments more recently in Oman, are they creating more jobs? The picture here shows the bubbles of the number of companies and the type of employment it creates and the level of development from startup to growing and exporting. Most of the companies are at the early stages of that development cycle for SMEs in the tech startups, and they tend to create a fewer jobs than expected otherwise. It would seem that startups at this moment are too nascent to create that effect that we see in the traditional businesses that are in manufacturing, in construction, and others. And perhaps the reason is that most of the funding and the companies in the tech startup are still at early stages. The Omani ecosystem for tech startups and innovation is somewhat taking its baby steps compared to some of our neighboring countries, which have taken some serious strides in those areas. I think there is more value to focus on this area because this is where the high value exports can be generated for the future. So to summarize really, I believe that the ecosystem in Oman has produced some decent results, but it's not at its maturity to connect SMEs to that goal of economic diversification, export diversification, and employment and job creation. And most of the jobs created right now by these types of companies, with the support that they get, still favors expatriate workers. And that is a conundrum for policymakers who are trying to create opportunities for local nationals. So self-employment is still not the effective tool that we're looking for. Economic diversification, the contribution is rather small and modest at the moment. And finally, even if we focus on the high value or would-be high value tech startups, I think we've got some time to get to that threshold and value creation that we hope to achieve for Oman at least. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا. شكرا دكتور أدهم على هذه المحاضرة القيمة وعلى التزامك.
Thank you, Dr. Adham, for this valuable contribution and respecting the time limit. And it's important what you said about this small and medium-sized companies. Our next speaker is Dr. Yousuf Al Balushi. He has over 20 years of experience, and he is the chief economist at the Oman 2030 vision, and he has held many important positions in the economic and banking system. He has a famous book entitled Oman's Economy and the Winds of Change, and also he lectured at King's College. Dr. Yousuf will be talking about the parameters of economic diversification in the Gulf region, Oman as an example. First of all, Assalamu alaikum. And can you please share the presentation? And first of all, I'm very happy, to take part in this workshop, and especially with the participation of such distinguished like His Excellency Mr. Adham and Dr. Hatim and others. The theme this workshop is tackling is very sensitive because in the Gulf region for more than 50 years, we are still reeling under the pressures of being reliant on the oil sector. As for my topic today, the title of the workshop is Diversification in general but I'll be alluding to specific reasons as to why the Gulf countries have failed in dealing with this theme successfully, although we started talking about it from the beginning of the 1970s. And there, in my opinion, there are three main reasons for the failure or the limited success. Before delving deeply into these reasons, I think we should say something about the pillars of development and diversification. I think we all agree that any formula or equation for this has to include important issues. First of all, the capital, whether local or foreign. Also, the banking sector's position and situation. And of course, what applies to Oman applies to a large extent to other Gulf countries. These countries have different impacts. Also, the job market, and His Excellency spoke about how the foreign workforce, not only in Oman and other Gulf countries too, are dominating the market. In Oman, we have, I think, 85% foreign workers, and maybe 80% of them have the education levels not higher than secondary school education. So therefore, they will not contribute in any meaningful way to innovation in the country, and they are of the low spending section also. Oman is a relatively large country, and whether we're talking about fishing or the mountainous region, or we're talking about logistics or the education sector, in fact, what we have of infrastructure maybe is not suitable. And also the ecosystem which combines all these factors is not there. Of course, these kind of economic calculations are interwoven, and they are weaved together. If we're talking about public finance, or if we're talking about the other factors, decision makers and economic experts have a limited understanding of the linkages, the deep linkages between these two four calculations, which is an important element in moving Gulf countries towards economic diversification. Sometimes financial policies and others are put before other considerations, and this has really resulted in the policies being incomplete, and I may refer back to this later on. The other element is the activation of the roles of different parties in the process of development, whether talking about investors and exporters from abroad or the internal factors within the country. This is very important to achieve development. Let's move to the three main reasons for our failure in economic diversification. The first reason is the business cycle really is not activated properly. our speakers maybe have mentioned this one way or another. We move in one direction. We have the exports, whether from the oil sector or others, bringing foreign currency into the government revenues, and the government spends that, and the public finance has the current account, which goes on wages and salaries, etc., and other expenditure, and also allocations for the capital. The problem faced by the Gulf countries is the supply generated by the government expenditure is fulfilled largely from the outside. This makes the economies of the Gulf countries rather fragile. For this reason, we suffered a lot